Greetings, friends. Welcome to everybody who's joining me on Zoom from the local congregations and those on YouTube, both from my local congregations on YouTube as well as those far and wide and those that'll see it after the fact. It's good to have you with me tonight. We are going to finish the book of Leviticus. If you're following on YouTube and you see this video is labeled Leviticus Part 18. It's an 18-part series that spanned, probably 7-8 months by now. I lost track, to be honest. But I said it from the beginning. I can still say Leviticus is one of my favorite books of the Bible because it deals with a lot of esoteric concepts that can seem like they're forgotten about by most of the world. But we know that when God says something, he says it with purpose. Every part of his word is said with purpose. And his law especially was given with purpose to show us the good and right way to live and to reveal who God is, what his plan is, and what he wants for us. Last time, it's been 3 weeks, but we covered quite a bit of territory last time. Leviticus chapter 25, we finished up that chapter, talking about those long-term cycles in the law of God, the Jubilee year especially, that 50-year celebration of the covenant obedience. It was all about the people keeping God first for a lifetime. And then Leviticus 26, we went through quickly, that describes very bluntly that the nation that obeys God is blessed, and those who don't obey God are cursed. But we talked about how this applies specifically to us in modern times as we're living through what may well be the end of the age, why American power and influence is waning, because our moral character, as described in this book, has gone by the wayside. And so we're reaping many of the curses that are there. Now, following up all those warnings about disobedience that come at the end of chapter 26, God closes the entire book of Leviticus with some final instructions about vows and redemption. And it can seem almost out of place given the sequence. I mean, if we look just real quick at Leviticus 26:46, where we stopped last time, these are the statutes and judgments and laws which the Lord made between himself and the children of Israel on Mount Sinai by the hand of Moses. Has a nice sense of finality to what's said there, but the book doesn't end there. God has a little bit more yet to say after having reviewed the covenant. Really, when we look at this, we're going to see how this final chapter of the book of Leviticus unifies the book and reveals God's great plan to redeem Israel and all of mankind. So let's go ahead and bow our heads and start with prayer before we get into the study. Almighty God, our loving Creator, we're thankful to you for your gift of life. We're thankful for your blessings on us, that you have called us to be your own special people. We thank you for your holy law, which teaches us the difference between the holy and the unholy, and the clean and the unclean. We learn so much of that through the law that you laid out in the book of Leviticus. We pray that you would open our minds to understanding once again tonight as we cover this final chapter. Help us to understand your purpose in describing the minutiae of how vows were given and how they were to be redeemed or paid under different circumstances, how it applies to us today as people redeemed by the blood of Jesus Christ and under a new covenant in a different time and place and world than what existed then. Be with us as we seek to understand these things and open our minds and our hearts to understanding, a better knowledge of you, and a better relationship with you. In the name of Jesus Christ, amen. All right, welcome to those who joined in the meantime while we were going through the introduction. I see several folks saying hi on YouTube, and I think we picked up one or two here on Zoom in the meantime as well. Let's dig in to Leviticus 27 and verse 1. Now the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, so it introduces a new prophetic utterance there. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to the children of Israel and say to them, when a man consecrates by a vow certain persons to the Lord according to your valuation. Okay, God starts talking this way all the time in these utterances where he's suddenly jumping into a topic and it almost gives you whiplash. Now, when a man consecrates by a vow certain persons to the Lord. So inherent in that is that a normal thing for people to do in ancient Israel under the Old Covenant was to make vows as an act of worship towards God. And some of those vows would involve vowing persons, whole persons, dedicating a person such as a servant in your household to God. If we look here at just the beginning of verse 2, again it says, as it does throughout the whole book of Leviticus, Speak to the children of Israel and say to them. So these instructions are for everyone. In this chapter, this verse does seem to kind of come out of nowhere, talking about vows of persons, and according to a valuation that's going to be set. You find out that's set by the priest, which we'll look at in detail. But essentially, the whole chapter is about things that have been consecrated to God, set apart to God by a vow or by God's ordination, and how to value those things for the purpose of redemption. Now, we're going to read about vowing persons. If we read just a little further, it says, if you vow certain persons to the Lord according to your valuation, and verses 3 through 6 describes different circumstances of life, whether the person is male or female, what their age is, are they young, are they in the prime of their life, or are they old? And on those criteria, different values were given. Now, what this is about, if we take a little step back and understand, you could dedicate persons to God. That means that if you had a servant in your household and you dedicated that person to God, well, you had a couple of options. Either that person packs their bags and makes their way to the tabernacle and is going to serve God for the specified period of time of the vow, or this thing about valuation is God gave people a way out of these vows, or a way to, that's not the right way to say it really, a way to fulfill these vows through redemption of the vow. So instead of sending my faithful servant Eric or whoever off to the tabernacle for 3 years because that's what I vowed with my mouth, I made a promise to God in saying that, instead of that, I can pay a certain amount based on Eric's age in my little example there. And Eric gets to stay put, he gets to serve in my household, and I have fulfilled my vow. In addition to vowing persons, you find other cases. So the structure of this chapter is as follows. You find persons here at the beginning. In verse 9, it gets into animals that you would have vowed to the Lord. If you, for example, had a bunch of calves born and you decided you want to dedicate them to God, you now vowed them. Either you give them over to the priest for their use, or you keep them for yourself but pay the money or follow the rules that are there. So actually that's not exactly what happens, but we'll cover it. You can also dedicate houses, your whole house, or fields. Houses are in verse 14, fields in verse 16, and then towards the latter part of the chapter it gets into tithes, which might seem kind of strange. We don't think of tithes as a vow. If we're talking about vows, we need to understand what a vow is, just in common sense terms and in religious terms. So we could say, just a layperson's definition here of a vow is a religious promise that's made to God. A religious promise that is made to God. That's what we mean by a vow. And it could take all kinds of different forms. And in fact, it's one of those things that's really out there to whatever it is that you promise you were to give. I think I mentioned that thematically, it almost seems like we're taking a step backwards. We had this chapter that concluded on that high point of covenant obedience and what was required, and disobedience and the curses for it. So why now get down to the nitty-gritty of making vows in the final chapter of the book of Leviticus, following such a crescendo in the whole book? Well, common sense answer: it matters to God what we say, and that we do what we say we'll do. Jesus talked about this. It's so important, in fact, that it is enshrined in the Sermon on the Mount. Matthew chapter 5 and verse 37. I'll turn over there. Matthew 5 and verse 37 is a section where Jesus Christ spoke about vows. Now we have to understand that by the time Christ came in the flesh, the Jews had twisted and perverted the practice of vows and were exploiting their whole system of vows and saying that some vows were really binding and some vows really weren't. And you could, if you swore by this or that thing, then maybe you weren't as liable as if you swore by something more serious. So let's read it in Matthew 5, verse 37. Here Christ says, going back to verse 36, "You shall not swear by your head, because you can't make one hair white or black." Earlier he says, don't swear at all in verse 34. "Neither by heaven, for it's God's throne, nor," verse 35, "by the earth, for it's his footstool, nor by Jerusalem, for it's the city of the great king." So you get the idea of people who are swearing by different things, and maybe if they swear by Jerusalem, that they don't mean that as heartily as if they swear by God or whatever they might swear by. Verse 36, you shall not swear by your head. You can't make one hair white or black, but let your yes be yes and your no, no. For whatever is more than these is from the evil one. So really Christ's instructions there were telling people, you're playing these games with vows to different places, people, objects, entities, whatever, and you're not really fulfilling your word when you're doing it, and I've had enough of that. God doesn't want us doing that. He wants our yes to be yes and our no to be no. So Jesus is essentially saying it's not good to make vows at all. Verse 34 says it that way. I say to you, do not swear at all, neither by any of these things. However, really the better sense to understand this from that cultural perspective is he's not giving a blanket, no vows, because there are vows that are appropriate and good for a person to take in their life. Two big ones that are still practiced today. Those who get married take wedding vows. They vow, they make an agreement for life, and they verbally commit to it as a vow to that person before God. And secondly, we do make a vow to God and his covenant when we are baptized. We have the questions that are asked when a person is about to be baptized that constitutes a vow, that they have repented of their sins, that they've accepted Christ as their Savior, and that constitutes a vow before God. In the Old Testament culture, in the culture of Jesus' day, taking vows was just much more common. It was even an expected part of religious life. That's why Leviticus 27 covers it, because God saw the need for this practice to be regulated, because God cares about the words of our mouth. He gave repeated warnings, in fact, against foolish vows. You find those come through in the narrative, like Jephthah, one of the judges. He made a foolish vow and he paid for it. It really affected his family. There's a whole story to that I won't get into, but you can look it up in the UCG Bible commentary if you don't know that story and the details of it. But also within the wisdom books, within the Proverbs, God warns against making foolish vows. Additionally, I believe we talked about earlier in this study, somewhere along the way in one of those 17 other parts, talked about the fact that God did have protection in place for women making vows. That if a woman was not married, her father had the right to annul a vow that she had made when he heard it, or the husband, if she was married, had the right to cancel that vow out when he heard it. Now, if he heard it and didn't speak up, then he lost that privilege, but got that right to refuse the vow. So God thought it was important that we guard the words of our mouth when we make promises about anything. We need our yes to be yes and our no to be no. And Christ elaborated on that in Matthew chapter 12, verse 25, which we'll turn over to. Since we're in Matthew anyway, that's the way I always look at it. If we're there anyway, in the same book, might as well look over a little further. Matthew 12, 25 through 27 reads as follows. Jesus, as he was speaking with the Pharisees, says he knew their thoughts and said to them, this is not what I'm looking for. Is it? Nope. Is it Matthew 13? It's not. I may not be able to find this one. Let's see. The one I was looking for, it may come up later, but I'll just quote it as best I can from memory. It's the one where Christ said that every idle word that men speak will be brought into judgment. Every idle word that men speak. The idea of an idle word as it's used there, and I'm pretty sure it's Matthew. Somebody can try to look it up for me based off my vague description, but it might be fruitless. And anyway, the point is that God takes the words of our mouth very seriously. If we speak idle words, that is us saying we're going to do something, but then being idle. In other words, not taking the action that's appropriate for what it is we've said we'll do. Just to give a quick personal note on this about that concept of idle words. Oh, thank you. On YouTube there, we got it cleared up. It's Matthew 12:36, so I was just a few verses too short. And I think I was going to start in verse 35. I had listed 25. It says, a good man out of the good treasure of his heart brings forth good things. An evil man out of the evil treasure brings forth evil things. But I say to you that for every idle word men may speak, they will give account of it in the day of judgment. For by your words you will be justified, that is our profession of faith, that taking of a vow before God at baptism, and by your words you will be condemned. if we're speaking these idle words. So the thing I was going to share personally, someone who was relatively new to the Church of God, over the course after they were baptized and were just talking with me, totally unrelated to this verse in particular, but just noticing kind of a difference between other churches they've been a part of and the Church of God that they're in now. What they told me was that when someone tells them, hey, I'll call you and we'll make plans, or we'll have you over sometime, those aren't just empty words. They actually get the call and they get the invite. They weren't used to that. Pretty amazing, for me as a pastor to hear that kind of testimony about the brethren that we might even start to take for granted. It seems like such a small thing. We might flippantly say like, oh yeah, let me get your number. I'll call you sometime, and then just never do it. If we do say we're going to call somebody, it's important we do. So I think it's important. Number one, we don't take that idea for granted among us, that just because we're used to each other being very, very diligent and following up on the words of our mouth, we need to make sure we continue that. Appreciating that as the people of God, we are people of our word, and we got to strive to continue living up to that as a group. But I did want to share that because I thought it was pretty cool. Let's get back into Leviticus 27, and we'll go a little bit further. So verses 4 through 7, or actually 3 through 7, deals with the different valuations. So our heads are back, we've got the context, vows are important, the things we say are important. If I promise God in a moment, if I'm an ancient Israelite, I'm going to dedicate 5 of my best servants to your service for the next year, then I have to make good on that. I don't get to just say that and then forget I did it, or the time comes and it's like, well, I didn't really mean that. It went out from my mouth, and now I am bound to it in God's eyes. The valuations come in verse 3. So if it's a male from 20 years up to 60 years, so that's a person in the prime of their life, the valuation shall be 50 shekels of silver, and it goes down from there. A female would be 30 shekels of silver, so females are valued less. If 5 years old up to 20 years old, the value shall be 20 shekels for a male, for a female 10 shekels, and for a month old, so a little baby up to 5 years, then your valuation for a male shall be 5 shekels of silver, and for a female shall be 3 shekels of silver. Okay, so what's going on with this? We stop for a second. Some people might get up in arms and say, well, God is being sexist. He's valuing women less than men, or he's being ageist. He's valuing the young as better than the old, or whatever. That's not what's going on here. If someone who is vowed, remember this, if they are not redeemed by this valuation, what did they do? Well, they went and they actually worked there at the tabernacle. There was work to be done, the work of God. This person wasn't dedicated in name only. If they went, they were there to help. And this is just a fact of life. Certain people are able to help in different amounts. Certain genders are able to help in different amounts. Specifically, when it came to the tabernacle and temple, that's really important. The women were only allowed to come up to a certain point. So men could go a little further, at least in the temple. That was something not mandated by God that came a little later, it seems like. But also, for a woman, if she's unclean for a week because of her monthly cycle, well, that takes her out of service for a portion that is deducted from the valuation. You can look at it that way. Or for a young child, there's simply things they cannot do in service that a 25-year-old man can do, or that even a 70-year-old woman can do, that a young child cannot do. So this is the reason for the distinctions. It's based on how much work they could get out of this person, the value of it, on average based on the age and sex of the person. So it's a practical value of how useful the various classes of people would be in carrying out that work of the tabernacle. Not any kind of discrimination. We know God is not like that. He values all people as people equally, but when it comes to doing this physical labor, some people are able to do physically more than others. Fact of life. In verse 6, just a little tie-in, where it talks about the valuation for a male from a month old up to 5 years old, so that's the lowest category for males, would be 5 shekels of silver. You can cross-reference that, if we had to hold our place there, to Numbers chapter 3 and verse 47. This is kind of a technical thing, but I'd like to get technical once in a while. I like to do the big, high-flying symbolism stuff, but I also like to deal with the more technical matters of cross-referencing in the Bible, and this one stood out to me. Numbers 3 is where we find, and this is just in our Bibles, just a couple pages over from where we are in Leviticus 27. Numbers 3 is where God was redeeming all the firstborn males out of Israel after they left Egypt. And what he was going to do was every one of the Levites, they were being dedicated to God on behalf of all the firstborn. So they counted up all the Levites. There were 22,000 of them. They counted up all the firstborn males of Israel. There were 22,273 of them. So there's a little more left over that you can't swap person for person, a Levite for one of these males out of the tribes of Israel, firstborn males. So that's the situation, the setting for Numbers 3:47. And when it gets down to it, what do you do about those extra 273 people that still need to be redeemed? The others are redeemed person for person, but these 273 will be redeemed with money because there's no Levite males left over to redeem them from. And it says, you shall take 5 shekels for each one individually. You shall take them in the currency of the shekel of the sanctuary, the shekel of 20 gerahs. So the same shekel. So the point was, and it explains in verse 46 also that redemption of the 273 of the firstborn of the children of Israel who are more than the number of Levites, so those leftovers, were basically counted from the lowest cost number of, the lowest cost category for males, the young kids. So basically, they took the Levites for the firstborn males, man for man, boy for boy, and they considered those 273 left over were the young kids with the way that it was reckoned, so that 5 shekels each was paid. So it was just interesting to see that. Now, the redemption of the firstborn was, in fact, we're dealing with redemption of persons that are vowed to God. The firstborn redemption was mandated by God, but still it's treated under similar rules as a vow. In fact, you could say it's a type of vow, just one that's required by God. And that's the thing, God, just like he required offerings, which we saw all through the beginning of the book of Leviticus, God required offerings, and some of those, he like we do on our holy days today, we are required to bring a free will offering. We get to determine the amount. When it came to the firstborn as well as to tithes, those are similar to vows, but that are required by God. So we'll keep that in mind as we go through this. Getting back to Leviticus 27 and verse 8. Verse 8 kind of rounds out the part about redeeming people that have been vowed to God. It says that if he, that is the person who has made the vow of persons, their servants or whoever, if he is too poor to pay your valuation, then he shall present himself before the priest, and the priest shall set a value for him. According to the ability of him who vowed, the priest shall value him. Now this is very interesting because it basically says this person has made a vow of a person that is a servant from their household, but they themselves, maybe they need their servant or their field isn't going to get harvested and they are not going to be able to afford another servant to help harvest their field. They already have this one. And they are going to lose their income for that year. So God instituted this rule where the priest was given authority to set an income-based valuation that was suitable to the person making the vow when it was needed. The lesson there really reinforces what Jesus Christ said, that vows had to be paid. Your yes has to be yes and your no has to be no. If a person didn't have enough to pay their vow and yet they wanted to pay their vow still, God took pity on that, on their obedient heart, by allowing a lower value to suffice. A lower value than what was owed could be paid by them. All right, continuing down in verse 9. Verses 9 through 13 describe how to redeem vows concerning animals. There is a difference in how it was done for clean animals versus unclean animals that were given as vows. Basically, with the clean animals, whatever you had vowed, you had to give it. If you vowed, for example, the next born calf of my herd or whatever is going to be vowed to you, and then it came out lame, You can't say, well, I'll just give a good one instead and I'll keep the bad one. No, you had to give the bad one, and if you wanted to make it better, a better offering, then you were free to dedicate a good one along with it. But the one that you chose with the words of your mouth had to be the one given. Let's actually read it in verse 9. If it is an animal that men may bring as an offering to the Lord, that'd be a clean animal, all that anyone gives to the Lord shall be holy. So when you have said it, made that vow with your lips that it belonged to the Lord, you have vowed it to him, from that moment, it is holy. Remember, holy means something that is set apart, right? It is now set apart to God, and it's like it no longer belongs to you. It has to go to God. Verse 10, he shall not substitute it or exchange it, good for bad or bad for good. If he at all exchanges animal for animal, both it and the one exchanged for it shall be holy. And this is what I was saying. If you have an animal that you want to dedicate and then you find out there's a defect in it, if you want to give a better offering to God, I mean, you are free to just give the bad one to God like you had vowed, but a person might feel like they're not fulfilling the spirit of what they had meant to do. They probably assumed that when they chose this animal, they didn't mean to give one with a defect or one that was lame or had some kind of problem, was injured in some way, something like that. They meant to give a good animal. So this was their option. If they wanted to do that, if they felt that pinch in their spirit, then there was this instruction that if you want to make it right, you can't just switch them. You've got to give me a good animal along with the bad, which is just a very interesting concept. God says that creature is mine as it is. As it is, it's mine because it's been dedicated to me. Coming down to unclean animals in verse 11. If it's an unclean animal, which they do not offer as a sacrifice to the Lord. So the implication here, perhaps, is that in verse 9, so a clean animal can be brought as an offering, so probably the priests would use the vows for that purpose. Where do they get all the lambs for the daily sacrifice, for example? Maybe the priests kept their own flocks, but maybe that was supplemented also from people who brought vows, or there was need for all kinds of offerings that were made throughout the year by the priests that had to come from somewhere. So likely from the vows brought by the people, those things were supplied. So unclean animals, which they do not offer as a sacrifice to the Lord. Okay, what do we do with those? He shall present the animal before the priest, and the priest shall set a value for it, whether it's good or bad. So there's going to be a price set for this animal no matter what happens here. Whether it's good or bad, the priest sets a value. As you, the priest, value it, so it shall be. But if he wants at all to redeem it, he must add 1/5 to your valuation. So for unclean animals, the person could buy the animal back and keep it for themselves. They just had to add this extra 1/5 penalty, which we've seen before. That came up in the trespass offering, which we'll talk about again in a minute. So if he wants at all to redeem it, he must add 1/5 to your valuation. Now for unclean animals, it seemed like maybe unclean animals are more likely to be redeemed since they were usually going to be something that was for labor purposes. I mean, I'm thinking horses, I'm thinking mules or donkeys, or even camels used for transport, maybe animals with that you might end up dedicating to God that have another purpose, in helping plow your fields or whatever. In any case, the value is going to be set by the priests, and we'll take a look in just a second at another reference on that. I had a question come up on Zoom. It says, verse 10 is confusing. I understand what you said, but it says he shall not substitute or exchange it, but if he exchanges animal for animal. So right after he says that, so you shall not substitute it or exchange it. If he at all exchanges animal for animal, the rest of the verse explains, then both it and the one exchanged for it shall be holy. So in the end, I mean, even though the wording's a little confusing, it does say right there that both become holy. So the exchange is not exactly an exchange. It's like saying, well, God, I want to swap that animal out for a good one, so here's the good one, but now they're both just going to God. So I guess in a person's mind, they are exchanging it, right, giving the better offering, but along with that, they go ahead and give the bad animal, is the implication there. I hope that clears that up just a little bit, maybe. I do agree that it's explained in a strange way in the verse. He shall not exchange it. but if he at all exchanges it, then both it and the one exchange, that use of the word exchange, I wonder if in Hebrew it's as confusing as it is in English. Probably so. A lot of the Bible is written in really poetic forms of Hebrew that can be difficult to parse out. So sometimes things just don't have the precision and clarity that we want. Let's turn to Exodus chapter 13. Another reference about the redemption of unclean animals that we find in Scripture, and in fact ties into the redemption of the firstborn, because the firstborn of both people and animals had to be dedicated to God. It was like a mandated vow. It was automatic. If you've got a firstborn of an animal, firstborn of people, had to be dedicated to God. So Exodus 13, starting in verse 12, you shall set apart to the Lord all that open the womb. That would be the firstborn animal. That is, every firstborn that comes from an animal which you have, the males shall be the Lord's. But every firstborn of a donkey you shall redeem with a lamb. Okay, well, that's kind of interesting. So when I talked about the priest setting a valuation back in Leviticus 27, then perhaps that valuation was even in denominations of other animals. Like, oh, this donkey is worth a lamb. That seems to be the precedent that we find in Exodus 13 here. Or maybe for some other animal, you'd say, oh, that one's worth 2 goats. And maybe they had a dollar amount attached to that, or a shekel amount, a silver amount attached to that as well. But it seemed like maybe the denominations could be set in other animals, which is interesting. The firstborn of a donkey you shall redeem with a lamb, in verse 13. And if you will not redeem it, you shall break its neck. And all the firstborn of man among your sons you shall redeem. So it shall be when your son asks you in time to come, saying, what is this? That you shall say to him, by strength of hand the Lord brought us out of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. And it came to pass, when Pharaoh was stubborn about letting us go, the Lord killed all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both the firstborn of man and the firstborn of beast. Therefore I sacrifice to the Lord all males that open the womb, but all the firstborn of my sons I redeem. And that extended not just to the sons, but as we read there, the donkeys and the unclean animals and whatever else. So these laws of redemption, specifically the redemption of the firstborn, pointed them directly back to God sparing the firstborn in Egypt. In fact, God didn't just spare the firstborn, he redeemed them. He redeemed them by the blood of the Passover lambs that were slain in the Passover. Later, there was the redemption ceremony of the firstborn that involved the Levites that we see in Numbers 3 that we mentioned. All of this is pointing us to a very important fact that has implications for the new covenant. We're told that Jesus Christ is our Passover lamb. And in fact, we are redeemed by his blood. So when we read here in Exodus 13 that if you will not redeem this donkey, you shall break his neck, and then right after that, you're going to redeem the firstborn of your sons, makes it seem pretty serious. You better be redeeming the firstborn of your sons, he's saying. God set that standard to show that that this matter of redeeming the firstborn was really high on his mind. And understanding that it is a type of mandated vow. In other words, if we make the vow of saying that we are followers of God, then this is something that God is saying the person had to do at that time. For us, we give our whole selves in offer to God whenever we make our covenant with God through baptism. And there is an analogy there. If we come back to Leviticus 27, verses 26 and 27 finish out the thought about the redemption of unclean animals. So it jumps ahead, and then we'll go back. And it deals with the firstborn specifically. So where we were looking back in verse 11, 12, that was concerning things that were vowed. And there is this connection with what goes on with the firstborn. And the firstborn is dealt with in verse 26. So let's see that since we're on the topic, and it's coming up soon anyway. It says, the firstborn of the animals, which should be the Lord's firstborn, no man shall dedicate. In other words, if it's the firstborn, it already belongs to God. You can't turn around and say, I'm dedicating that one, because that one's already dedicated. So you can't double dip with an animal that was a firstborn to dedicate it to God. Whether it's an ox or a sheep, it is the Lord's. Verse 27 now informs what we read in Exodus 13. It says, if it's an unclean animal, then he shall redeem it according to your valuation, Okay, so we saw that option in Exodus 13. The other option was break its neck, right? If you shall not redeem the donkey, you shall break its neck. Well, here it says, you shall redeem it according to your valuation and shall add 1/5 to it, or if it's not redeemed, then it shall be sold according to your evaluation. So here, this is telling us a little caveat to that. You didn't have to break its neck like right away. In other words, it would go up for sale at the valuation the priest had set, and someone else therefore was going to be doing the purchase of it, which was in a way a redemption. You know, the word redeem is not used there. It's saying that it's sold to that person, but effectively you have another person redeeming that animal by purchasing it because it's done at the redemption value. This whole idea of adding 1/5 to the value, which comes up here again in verse 27, adding 1/5 to the valuation to redeem it. A couple of thoughts on that just for us to chew on. One that came to me was contained in Matthew chapter 25. I won't turn there, but it's the parable of the talents. The parable of the talents. And remember, what was the lesson there? What did every one of those servants who was entrusted with anything expected to do? They were expected to give a return on the investment. There had to be more than what had been given. So when it comes to what is belonging to God and a person being a steward over that, God expects that back with interest. So that was kind of a thought that just popped into my head that I thought I would share in connection with this adding 1/5 of the valuation. And maybe somebody can take that, run with it, think on it a little more. And if you tell me, sorry, Steve, there's just nothing to it, then that's fine. But maybe it'll be helpful to you in drawing out a little bit more understanding of these. The other thought is a little more direct, and that's the one I mentioned earlier, Leviticus 5, verse 14 through 16. I'll turn back there. Is where we find this similar adding 1/5 of the value in connection with the trespass offering. So Leviticus 5, verse 14 through 16. We covered this way back in part 2, but let's see if we can get back into it. Leviticus 5, verse 14. The Lord spoke to Moses saying, if a person commits a trespass and sins unintentionally in regard to the holy things of the Lord. Now, the holy things of the Lord are exactly what we're talking about in Leviticus 27. So let's wrap our head around that. There's a connection straight from chapter 5 to chapter 27 based on that fact. The holy things, if you vowed something to God, what happened to it? It is holy, right? When you vowed about that animal, it said that. It said it is holy to God when you have vowed it. Even if you want to exchange it, the one that you vowed about is holy. So regarding the holy things, the firstborn also count as something holy to God. God chose them as holy. And with a vow, I choose it to be holy to God. By a vow, I vow that it's holy and dedicated to God. That's how that works. With the firstborn, God made it holy to him by his choice. With the tithes, which also come up in Leviticus 27, God designated them as holy to him, that 10%. So that's to start with. We have the holy things of the Lord that are dealt with. So if a person commits a trespass and sins unintentionally in regard to the holy things of the Lord. So the trespass offering, remember the point of it was, well, it was to deal with any case where restitution could be made, even in a case of theft or something like that, but it also applied to theft from God by infringing on the holy things. In other words, maybe you've got a shepherd over your flocks, and he cooks up and eats one of the lambs that was designated as tithe, and he didn't know it. Well, that animal that he cooked up and ate was part of the holy things of the Lord. So there's got to be restitution for that. He sinned in ignorance against the holy things would be the situation there. So there had to be the trespass offering, and they had to have the valuation that went along with the trespass offering to make restitution. And verse 16 is where we see, he shall make restitution for the harm that he has done in regard to the holy thing, and shall add 1/5 to it, and give it to the priests. And so the priest shall make atonement for him with the ram and the trespass offering, and it shall be forgiven him. Now, if we come back to Leviticus 27 and understand how that ties in, what God gives with these laws of redemption concerning his holy things is he said, look, if in a lot of these cases, if you'd rather give money to fulfill your vow rather than actually going through with sending the person packing down to the tabernacle or having to get your animals there or whatever it may be, that the reason was. God says you can freely pay this price of redemption. Now, if you accidentally had transgressed against the holy things and eaten one of these animals without doing that redemption first, well, then you were in this position where you had to give the trespass offering plus go ahead and pay the redemption with that 1/5 penalty along with it. So kind of interesting to me how that all works out. God gave a way that you can pay off most of these with this redemption money. But if you accidentally went ahead and used it up, well, you're going to pay that amount, plus you're going to have to sacrifice another animal because you sinned in doing so carelessly. God, it matters to Him. He cares about how we treat the things that are holy to Him, whether it's vowed by our own mouth as holy to Him, something we've dedicated as a promise to Him, or whether it's something He has chosen, as firstborn, or the tithes and offerings and etc. All right, verse 14. Verse 14 begins to deal with dedicating a house to be holy to the Lord. Again, notice the language there. When a man dedicates his house to be holy to the Lord. And that is the point here. When a person was making this vow, they were dedicating something as belonging to God, to being holy. How could you dedicate your house? Well, one way you could do that, if you weren't going to pay the redemption money, which it says the priest shall set a value for it, just like everything else, whether it's good or bad. You might decide, you got a bad house, man. We're going to put the bar low on this one so you can redeem that. None of us have to live there. As the priest values it, so it shall stand. And if he who dedicated it wants to redeem his house, he must add 1/5 of the money to your valuation, and it shall be his. So if you wanted to dedicate your house and you weren't going to redeem it, then the priests would just make use of your house for whatever they needed. Maybe they needed to house some of the priests that were traveling in to help, or maybe they needed to house some of the Levites or whoever, and they could use the house for that purpose if the person was not willing to pay the redemption price. Now, what this shows for me is just the multitude of different ways the average person could give to the work of God at that time. Not everything was about the money, which the redemption deals with paying money for things rather than giving the thing itself, but not everything deals with giving great displays of wealth or money or whatever. A person who was dedicating their house, maybe somebody had a summer home, a house that they didn't need, that they owned, that was theirs for whatever reason, and they said, this house for the next year or two, I'm going to dedicate to the Lord's service. The priests can use it how they see fit. So that's a nice thing to do. Maybe 6 months into that, you got a family member who needs a place to live and you need that house back, and you go to the priest and you pay the redemption for it. You can fulfill that vow, but there's just all these different ways that a person could give to the work of God at that time, and that's still true today. And so many people in God's church, I know, do this. They make offerings of kinds that don't show up on your tax forms. Opening their homes to those who serve in the ministry with hospitality, for example. We don't typically make vows to God in regard to those things anymore. It's just not part of our culture now. But it does make the point that not every act of giving towards God has to be made in money. And God accepts that even when we've dedicated something to Him that we want to serve with, whether it's our car, giving people rides to and from services, whatever, sometimes we might have a human or logistical need to give money instead of the thing that we had vowed or promised to God. So interesting thoughts to me that stood out looking at this in preparation for the study today. So a person could dedicate their house. We talked about animals. We talked about dedicating their servants or persons. Now we come to verse 16 through 25, this section, which we're only going to skim through. Really, I'll just talk about it. Fields could likewise be dedicated by a vow. And we're getting a sense of how this works, how these valuations work, just like the people were valued according to how much labor they could actually do there in that situation, or the house is based on whether it's good or bad in terms of a place to live and for use by the priests. Fields could be dedicated by vow, and if we read just a little bit, if he gives part of his field as possession, then your valuation shall be according to the seed for it. An omer of barley seed shall be valued at 50 shekels of silver. So the idea is, how much is that field worth in terms of farmland, in terms of productive ability, its seed? How much of it is usable for producing something of value? So we see that maybe it's got a whole bunch of woods on it, that if anybody wanted to plant on that part, it'd have to be cleared. And no, you only count the part that's usable as farmland for production. Which was a deliberate choice here. God had to make that choice for them. And what if other uses of land came into play? Like what if it was a pasture instead of farmland? That could be a factor that you could have gone by, whether it's good pasture land or not, or how much of it is usable pasture land. And that's just not part of the equation. God chose for it to be done by how much it could bear in terms of seed and agriculture. Throughout the next verses, it gets a little technical. It talks about the Jubilee, which we discussed in detail last time. Because it's dealing with the land being offered, then you have to remember the Jubilee in that. So basically, the special instructions were that any land dedicated, the valuation would be made up to the years of Jubilee. In normal circumstances, it would be redeemed before the Jubilee, and any land that was dedicated and not redeemed before the Jubilee would simply become the possession of the priests from that point forward. So that was a way of giving it permanently to the priests that was possible under that system. So I'm just going to leave it at that. You can weed through those details and look at it through the lens of the Jubilee on your own time and your own study. So we've got, about 13 minutes left here and probably as many verses. So we better make up some ground. Verse 26 and 27 we actually covered already. So that was concerning the firstborn. Verse 28 says, "No devoted offering that a man may devote to the Lord of all that he has, both man and beast, or the field of his possession, shall be sold or redeemed. Every devoted offering is most holy to the Lord." So the idea behind that is, as I understand it, I think this is another one where the wording is a little difficult in different translations. I think the New King James puts it in a way that's a little less clear on what the meaning is than others. But the idea that I've understood out of this, and it has also been taught by the church, is that nothing could be that was vowed or that was part of God's holy things that were able to be redeemed. You can't redeem it and then turn around and sell it for money. So one example of that, this actually came from Dr. Dunkel's class from ABC, the example he used. Well, what if I dedicate a prized racehorse to God, and then I go and I redeem it so that I can sell it? Or what if that prized racehorse is the firstborn, right, out of my racehorse stables, and so I know it's worth a lot of money, and I redeem it because I want to sell it? Well, it's basically saying you can't do that. If it's been devoted to God and you redeem it, you cannot turn around and sell it. So you might want to redeem it for personal reasons other than just financial gain. Like, for example, you might have a son who says, "But Dad, that's my favorite horse. I want that horse." And so you go ahead and redeem it, and now it's yours. But not God. What God didn't want, what this law seems to be about, is God didn't want his people being motivated by greed or by profit in anything we do, and definitely didn't want anybody to be gaming the redemption system. That's what it seems to come down to. I mean, those thoughts, when we're giving something to God, that should be far from us anyway. We have to do everything in purity. So not wanting people to try to game the redemption process and be giving something and then turning around and making a profit off of it after you've redeemed it just wasn't right to do, God says. In other words, if you redeemed it, it's yours and you're keeping it. Verse 29 might seem a little bit strange. "No person under the ban," which sounds very ominous, "no person under the ban who may become doomed to destruction among men shall be redeemed, but surely shall be put to death." Okay, so by the end of that verse, we figure out what it means by the ban and doomed to destruction. A person who is supposed to be put to death, you can't have a servant who's on death row and say, "Oh, I can, I've got a special kind of pardon. I'll have him dedicated to the Lord and redeem him, and then he's mine again and he's free from this death penalty." No, God didn't want people gaming the system. God's concerned with justice. This was another protection against a type of abuse that God foresaw people might try to take advantage of. So if a servant's on death row, you can't offer him to God to get him out of it. It just didn't work that way. Verse 30. In verse 30, we come into talking about tithe, which I mentioned is another, almost like a mandated vow from God. It's something that's holy to God by default. It's something that's owed to God. If we read about it in verse 30, it starts with the tithe of the field, and tithe applies to more than just things that grow on trees and things that grow out of the ground. We understand that. It applies to more than just animals born in herds and flocks. But the cases that are dealt with here in Leviticus apply only to those situations. All the tithe of the land, whether it's of the seed of the land or the fruit of the tree, is the Lord's. It's holy to the Lord. That's the principle. The principle that the tithe is holy to the Lord applies to tithe of everything. It applies to our money today. When we receive our income, we know that there's a portion of that is holy to the Lord, that we have to be diligent over. So it's holy to the Lord. All the tithe is holy to the Lord. Verse 31, so it's set apart. God chose to set it apart, just like a vow might set something apart as holy. This is made by default by God for us if we're his followers. Verse 31, if a man wants at all to redeem any of his tithes, he shall add 1/5 to it. So we get this special instruction on the fact that you could redeem your crops if you wanted to with that 1/5 penalty that was the normal penalty for redeeming something before God. Importantly, you find out in the book of Deuteronomy that for what we know as second tithe, there was no penalty necessary. You could exchange it for money, it says, and go and purchase whatever your heart desires. No mention of a penalty there for the second tithe, which is one reason we know it's a separate tithe from the first. Do notice that there's really no instruction here or anywhere about how the setting apart was to be done exactly when you were harvesting a field or off your trees. I mean, it's something, I imagine you send a bunch of workers out and each one is kind of gathering things. I mean, what would you do? Would you have you have to have a way to do it. Do you have each worker have a special tithe basket, and after he fills up, the first 9 apples, he chucks one in the tithe basket? Or does he do 9 whole baskets and then fill up 1 whole basket of tithe? Or do you just gather it all up and at the end just take a big divider and divide it into 10 piles and give one of them? There's any number of ways it could have been done, but we're not told exactly how it was to be collected or done in the case of crops and trees. But when it came to animals, we are given a specific way. In verse 32, I think it's very interesting. Concerning the tithe of the herd or the flock, whatever passes under the rod, the 10th one shall be holy to the Lord. Okay, so whenever these animals are born into your flock or herd, the way you are to do it, they would call the animals in, and each one would pass under the shepherd's rod that he held out. The 10th one that passed under the rod, that was the one God wanted. He specified it, and that was law. In addition to that, very similar to what we saw for animals that were vowed previously, we see a very similar situation here with that same confusing wording in verse 33 as we saw earlier. He shall not inquire whether it, that is that 10th animal coming under the rod, is good or bad, nor shall he exchange it. And if he exchanges it at all, then both it and the one exchanged for it shall be holy. It shall not be redeemed. So just like an animal that was vowed, same rule applied. In this case, if that 10th animal that comes out is one that's lame or blind or whatever, that's the one you give to God. If in your heart you feel like you want to give better to him, then you go ahead and give that one, and you give a good one along with it. You can't swap them out and keep the bad one for yourself and use the meat or whatever you might think to do. So that's another similarity that we see here with vows. In fact, for the tithe of the seed of the land is very similar to what takes place with the field, which was reckoned by the seed production. And if you wanted to redeem it, it was the seed production plus 1/5. Same as the redemption of the tithe was adding 1/5 to what was actually harvested there. So we see that. And very interestingly, this kind of last connection on this point of why I'm saying that a vow is like that tithe and the firstborn are like vows that are made by default that God enforces. The first mention of tithing in the Bible, it's a good trivia question maybe. The first mention of tithing in the Bible was from Jacob. And when Jacob did so, when he agreed to tithe, he actually made a vow saying that he would tithe on whatever God gave him. If God would lead him throughout his life and grant him the blessings that God had shown him, then he was going to give a tenth out of everything that God gave to him. You find that account, I won't turn to it for sake of time. That's Genesis 28 and verse 22, where Jacob makes a vow to say that he would tithe to God. Not that Jacob thought up the idea of tithing, it's just the first time we're encountering tithing, and in his vow to God, he's acknowledging God's law of tithe, which he got the idea from somewhere. Actually, it's not the first mention of tithing. I need to correct myself here while I can. Abraham tithed on the spoils of his victory over the kings of, that situation where Lot got taken captive. I think Jacob's is the second mention of tithing. So I failed my own trivia. Come on, give me a break tonight. But I caught myself, which is good. So first mention of tithing was actually Abraham on the spoils of war when he rescued his nephew Lot. But the second mention of tithing with Jacob, when he did it, he did it by a vow that he mentioned that he would tithe to God as part of his personal covenant with God. We also have tithing as part of our covenant with God today. We understand that. I have just a few final thoughts and scriptures to wrap up here. I know we've only got one verse in the book, so let's see how long we can stretch it out. Turn with me to Ezekiel chapter 20 and verse 37. Ezekiel chapter 20 and verse 37. Yeah, somebody was going to catch me there on YouTube. You knew. You knew something was right, but it wasn't quite right. But I hope you would have said it even if I hadn't caught myself. I'm glad I did. Ezekiel 20 and verse 37. Here in the prophet Ezekiel, it doesn't talk about tithing directly. However, we get a similar idea. It's oblique. It's an oblique reference. It's not the strongest tie-in or connection, but follow the logic here. In Ezekiel 20, verse 37, it says, this is God saying, I will make you pass under the rod, and I will bring you into the bond of the covenant. Pass under the rod. That's exactly what it said. The 10th one that passes under the rod shall be holy to the Lord. And here God is using that same language about making his people pass under the rod, and in the process, bringing them into the bond of the covenant. The covenant people are God's holy people. So there's a connection here. God is comparing his people to an animal that was born belonging to him. And the way animals were set apart were by that designation, vows of a person, the firstborn, which God had instituted, or the tithe, which God had instituted. But here, us, in our life, we become set apart to God, we become holy to God through the covenant. So that imagery of passing under the rod connected to the holiness that comes from being in the bond of covenant with God. So as a final thought where this kind of led me to Leviticus as a whole. I'm going to attempt to wrap up the whole book and everything we've seen in 18 parts here now. Leviticus is the book where, as we saw in Leviticus chapter 10, after Nadab and Abihu, which is really the central story element that drives so much of what we read in the book of Leviticus, he said that the priests were to teach the difference between the holy and the unholy. Okay? Leviticus is the book where this happens, where the difference between the holy and the unholy is made, and everything that goes along with that. Clean and unclean is part of that as well. God's people have this comparison to people who have made a vow, devoting ourselves to God as holy to him. When we make a vow at baptism, which we do, we have dedicated ourselves 100% to God. At that point, we're dedicating ourselves to fulfill all the commandments. In fact, starting with the greatest commandment, to serve God with all our heart, our soul, and our strength. We've given ourselves entirely as holy to him as servants. That's one connection. It's like we've made a vow and we've become this holy portion to God by entering into the baptism covenant. Further, we are compared to the tithe here in Ezekiel 20. Another holy portion which was designated by God, chosen by God as belonging to him. As people chosen by God, we are like a tithe that's been taken out of the world. We're also like firstborn that have been taken out of the world, because we know that we are to be the first fruits of God's kingdom. Turn with me to 1 Peter chapter 1, and we'll develop the thought just a little further before we conclude. 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse 17. You might recall over the course of the study, we were in 1 Peter chapters 1, 2, and 3 quite a lot over the course of the study, because Peter uses so much language about the ideas of clean and unclean, holy and unholy, of what is pure and impure, all those things, all those concepts that are directly related to the things in Leviticus. And here at the end of the book, we come to the end of the book of Leviticus. We come to one more reason to come to 1 Peter chapter 1. Verse 17 it says, "If you call on the Father, who without partiality judges according to each one's work, conduct yourselves through the time of your stay here in fear, knowing that you were not redeemed with corruptible things." That is, we are not redeemed with money, not silver and gold from your aimless conduct by tradition from your fathers. We are not redeemed with that silver, the shekels of the redemption money like is talked about under the law of the Old Covenant. No, verse 19 says we are redeemed with the precious blood of Christ, as of a lamb without blemish and without spot. Seeing that we have been purchased back from slavery to sin by the blood of Christ, we have been redeemed by the giving of a lamb, just like a lamb was given for the firstborn instead of a donkey, instead of the firstborn of the donkey. But we see that God is working through this concept of redemption to tell us about what he has done for us. In the book of Leviticus, you know, all those details we went through, the technicalities of it, the redemption of all kinds of different stuff, it all relates to how we are redeemed by Jesus Christ, how we are to redeem our time, as we're told. Revelation chapter 14, concluding the entire Bible here, verses 3 and 4 in Revelation 14 hit on this concept of being redeemed again, speaking of God's people, and also ties it in with the concept of first fruits. Revelation 14 verse 3 is speaking of the 144,000. It says, "They sang a new song before the throne, before the living creatures and the elders. No one could learn the song except the 144,000 who were redeemed from the earth." Okay, so this is a portion. Got to remember in context, the 144,000 are not the entirety of God's people that are redeemed. It's simply those from the physical descendants of the tribes of Israel. There's also a multitude. You find that elsewhere. But they are redeemed from the earth. These are the ones who were not defiled with women. That is, they had kept themselves sexually pure. They are virgins. These are ones that were not only sexually pure in the flesh, but had fled every impurity of both flesh and spirit, which we found in 1 Corinthians 7, another place that we went to quite a lot, especially early on in the book of Leviticus. We're told, "Come out of her, my people, touch no unclean thing." That was in Isaiah and echoed again in 1 Corinthians 6, where I was just quoting from also. People undefiled by false religion, people who are virgins, followers of God. These are the ones who follow the Lamb wherever he goes. These were redeemed from among men, being first fruits to God and to the Lamb. The first fruits, very similar to the firstborn, was another designated holy thing to God, something chosen out of the whole earth. And that's what God's church is. We're chosen out of the whole earth. We're redeemed from among men, from every nation, tribe, and tongue, it says elsewhere in connection with this 144,000 too, in that mixed multitude. The first fruits are dedicated to God, being given not only the promise of a glorious inheritance to come, but we are given the precious knowledge of the full harvest. Being first fruits means that there is a full harvest to come after us. We're the first fruits to the full harvest of mankind that's completed in the second resurrection at the end of 1,000 years. So with all that in mind, we're ready to conclude the chapter back in Leviticus chapter 27. Verse 34, final words to send us off. "These are the commandments which the Lord commanded Moses for the children of Israel on Mount Sinai." These commandments are not something that are far off from the God we know and worship. They're not far off from Jesus Christ and the God of the New Testament, because it's the same God the whole way through. In fact, these laws throughout the whole book of Leviticus are central to the work of God the Father, central to the person and work of Jesus Christ. They teach us about what our God wants from us. They teach us about who our God is and what his principles are. And I hope that we've appreciated that all through this study. I know it's deepened my appreciation of it, just putting it together to serve you with. I hope it's had a positive effect in your life too over the last several months. And for those that'll see this, as it's posted on YouTube, well, forever until they take us down. So that concludes my material for the night. Does anybody have any questions to pose here at the end? I'll give it just a second to refresh my voice.
Dr. Britt, this is Steve. I don't have a question, but I do have a comment. I wasn't thrilled when you said we're going to do Leviticus, my favorite book. It's kind of dull, it's all this stuff about the redeeming but man, I was really pleased with it because it sure has opened my eyes to how much there is other takeaways from it. There's a lot more throughout the Bible that's summed up right in there. It all interplays. And I've really come to see that the Bible is really integrated with all the Old and New Testament, and even all these things about the firstborn and about Nadab and Abihu and the reasons for everything happening. It really opened my eyes a lot, so I certainly did enjoy it.
All right, I appreciate the kind words. Yeah, I certainly, I get that feeling every time I open the Bible now. There's always these interconnections, and you can just see the signature of the God who wrote it all and inspired it all over it. So I think my part of my tagline for this series that it made its way into every one of my emails about it, for those that were on that email list, was "Open my eyes that I may behold wonderful things from your law." It comes from Psalm 119. And this is part of just the God's purpose in giving the law, is to reveal who he is and what he's like. So I hope everybody did appreciate that. It's kind of sad concluding the book of Leviticus. Almost makes us wish there were more, even though we've been doing it for months. But it's been good to have you all along with me for the journey. I will, for my future Bible study plans, I'm planning to take a break for a while, probably until after the Feast of Tabernacles this year at least. But time will fly. I'll be back with another Bible study series before you know it. So with that, I guess I'll sign off for the night. And of course, if anybody does have other questions that come to you at another time, feel free to email me at Steven_Britt@ucg.org. And I'll be happy to answer it best I can. And someone on YouTube just asking, what are we going to be studying next? So I was just saying I'm going to take a break at least till after the Feast of Tabernacles, and I'll have to pray about it and figure out what to do for the next time. I mean, every time I read a book of the Bible, I'm like, to cover that in the next Bible study series. And then, by the time I get to it, I'll move on to something else. So we'll see how God moves me in the meantime. And maybe if people have a request for what they think would be interesting to do next, or what would be good, you're welcome to send that to me as well. All right, friends, with that, I'll say good night. Thank you very much for following along, for joining me tonight and along the way. Take care and God bless you.
Thank you.